Tonight, drift back to the grey half-hour before the king wakes. The room is already lit. Not by the king. He is still behind the drawn curtains of the great bed, asleep, the heavy embroidered hangings holding the warmth inside them. The room belongs, in this quiet hour, to the people who have been awake since before the dawn, moving softly through the chamber, tending to what the king will never notice because it will all be arranged before he opens his eyes. The fire is the first thing. Someone built it up an hour ago in the cold of the pre-dawn, and by now it holds steady, its warmth already smoothing the sharp chill out of the stone air. The floor rushes afresh, strewn with sweet herbs, lavender, meadowsweet, and in the hush you can catch their faint green scent against the wood smoke. Beeswax candles are already burning on the great oak chest by the wall, their light clean and warm, without smoke. This is where a king's day begins, in a room arranged in advance by many quiet hands for one sleeping person. What a medieval king really did all day was not what the stories usually remember. He was not locked all morning in a council chamber managing wars. He was not riding from battlefield to battlefield in a blaze of glory. His day was something older and quieter than that. A slow, ordered round of waking and washing, prayer and paperwork, ceremony and leisure and charity, beginning in this warmed chamber and ending here again, with the curtains drawn and the fire banked low. Every hour had its appointed office. Every office had its man. And from first light until the last candle was snuffed tonight, the king would move through it all carried, quietly, attentively, with very great care, by the people around him. Even his waking was a ceremony, with its own servants and its own small rituals, and in a moment one of the chamber grooms will step forward, draw back the curtain with a practiced hand, and the long, ordered, unhurried day will begin. You are in the royal great chamber, and the hour is early. Outside the windows the sky is the flat, even grey of a morning that has not yet decided to be morning. That particular light that is neither night nor day, that belongs to neither side of the division. Inside, the room is warm. The fire has been burning for the better part of an hour, the logs placed with care so they give a steady, even heat rather than a roaring and crackling blaze. The kind of warmth that takes the chill from stone without drama, that fills the room like a tide rather than a wave. The candles on the great chest by the wall burn without a flicker. The floor rushes are undisturbed. The basin sits waiting by the wall, the towel folded beside it. Everything is in its place. Everything is ready, and has been ready for some time, and the king is still asleep. The great bed of estate is the centrepiece of the room and, by any accounting you care to make, the most valuable single object in the palace. It is vast, a curtained, canopied structure so large that it functions less as a place to sleep than as a stage from which a life is conducted, an institution as much as a piece of furniture. The posts rise close to the ceiling. The tester overhead, the flat canopy that caps the whole structure, is embroidered with the arms of the royal house in silk and gold thread, the work of many months of skilled labour. The curtains hang on all four sides, heavy and lined, and behind them the king rests on a deep feather mattress, on linen sheets changed far more frequently than any other linen in the household, under coverlets of fine wool and fur. Inventories from 13th and 14th century households attend to beds of estate with extraordinary care and attention, listing the mattress, the bolster, the coverlets, the curtains, the tester, the rods, the embroidered valances, the great chest at the foot, and appending to each item a value that makes clear why these objects were so carefully maintained. A king's bed was worth more, in ready money, than most men earned in several years of labour. It was also, in ways that went beyond its material value, the symbolic centre of his power. Ambassadors were sometimes received in it. Announcements of consequence were sometimes made from it. To be admitted to the chamber in which the bed stood was a mark of favour. To stand beside it was a higher mark still. But right now it is simply a curtained enclosure with the king sleeping behind it, and the chamber belongs to the men who tend it. You might pause for a moment on this arrangement, because it is one of the things that separates the medieval king's mourning most sharply from any mourning you have known. By today's standards, a head of state waking in the morning might have a small security detail outside the door, a phone on the bedside table, and a schedule waiting in an inbox. The medieval king had instead a room full of trusted men who had been awake for an hour already, a fire already burning, a ewer of warmed water waiting, and a set of robes laid out in order. No alarm clock, no notification, no email requiring an urgent response, but also no privacy, no quiet breakfast alone, and definitely no solitary walk to the bathroom unobserved. Every moment of the morning, from the drawing of the curtain to the arrival at the chapel door, was attended. The men who sleep nearest the royal body are not chosen carelessly or arbitrarily. The grooms and esquires of the chamber who take their rest in or just outside the room, on pallets near the door or in the antechamber beyond, are men of trust, sometimes of quite high rank, chosen for their discretion and their reliability as much as for their practical abilities. Physical nearness to the king in the medieval world was not merely a domestic convenience. It was a form of intimacy that carried real political weight, recognized by everyone who understood how courts worked. At a court where access to the king's person was the most valuable currency in circulation, more sought after than land or money in many men's reckoning, to sleep within earshot of him, to be one of the first faces he saw in the morning, to be present in the chamber before the formal audiences began and before the great officers arrived with their rolls and their petitions, was to possess something that other men at court could not easily obtain. The closeness was the thing. The closeness was the honour, and the honour was real, and men of considerable standing competed for it. At the grandest courts of the later Middle Ages, particularly the Burgundian court of Philip the Good and Charles the Bold, which by the 15th century had pushed the ceremony of royal daily life to its most elaborate and precisely regulated expression, the king's rising became a formal ceremony in its own right, something called the lever, the lifting, in which noblemen of different ranks attended, in a carefully specified sequence, each with his own role in the morning's unfolding ritual. Olivier de la Marche, who spent his adult life at the Burgundian court serving 3 successive dukes as page, officer, and eventually as the duke's principal household officer, left detailed memoirs of what he saw and participated in, and his account of the principle is clear. that to serve the prince in his most intimate and private affairs was regarded as the greatest honour a nobleman could hold at court. The man who handed the duke his shirt was not performing a menial task. He was performing a lordly one. At the most ceremonious courts, the shirt passed from hand to hand up a chain of rank before it reached the ducal body. A small, ordered procession of honour compressed into the space of a bedchamber, each man's place in the chain expressing precisely his standing in the household's hierarchy. The earlier English court was plainer than this Burgundian ideal. The elaborate lever was the aspirational, grand court version. What royal ceremony could become when a great household had the resources and the cultural ambition to develop it to its furthest and most ritualized expression. An ordinary English morning in the 12th or 13th century was a quieter, more workmanlike affair. Fewer men in the chamber, fewer formalized roles, less ceremony in the exact sequence of actions. But the principle was the same, even when the ceremony was simpler. The king did not simply get up. He was raised. Picture the moment the curtain is drawn back. The chamber groom who does it has done it hundreds of times and knows exactly how. He knows to move the curtain slowly, not to swing it wide and let cold air billow across the bed. He knows the particular quality of this king's waking, whether he surfaces quickly into alertness or prefers to lie still for a moment, finding the shape of the morning, whether he sits up immediately or takes a breath before he moves. The fire is burning. The room is warm. The candles are lit, their small flames perfectly still in the air of a room no draught has touched. Beyond the window, the grey is beginning to shift towards something that might be called light. The king opens his eyes. The morning is already arranged around him. This is the first of the day's many ceremonies, and in some ways the most telling. It establishes the pattern that will hold from this moment until the last candle is snuffed tonight. The king at the centre, and the world ordered by other people's labour and attention to meet him there. He did not light the fire. He did not place the candles or lay the rushes or fold the towel or set the basin in its place. His comfort is not the result of his own effort, but of the quiet and continuous effort of many others working around and before him. And this is not an accident of his particular temperament, but the deliberate structure of how royal life was organized and understood. A king occupied with his own fire would not be available to govern. So the fire was someone else's responsibility, and the candles were, and the basin, and the towel, and the robe, and the ring. By modern standards, this level of personal service would seem an almost extraordinary luxury, something closer to a well-staffed residence than anything most people encounter in ordinary life. But in the medieval understanding, it was simply the correct and rational organization of a household around its central purpose. The whole private apparatus of the morning was managed so that when the king was needed, by the chapel, by the council, by the hall, he was unencumbered, present, and ready. This was the logic of the royal household, that its labour existed so that the king's attention could be directed outward. By the later Middle Ages, as courts grew larger and more ceremonious, the lever at its grandest had become a carefully graded sequence. Different grades of noblemen entered the chamber in stages, each performing a specific and honoured act of attendance. The precise order was sometimes written down, so that each man knew his appointed moment and could take his place in the sequence without hesitation or confusion. Who entered first, who helped with the shoes, who brought the robe, who poured the water. The king moved through all of this with the composed stillness of a person who had been served every morning of his adult life and had learned to hold himself for it. Not imperiously or impatiently, but with a kind of practised readiness, the way a person holds still for a portrait. At a simpler court, on an ordinary morning, the same sequence was accomplished by fewer hands with less choreography. A trusted groom brought the basin and the towel. Another brought the robe from the wardrobe. A page or a squire held the necessary items in the necessary order. The king dressed, the men attended him, and the chamber gradually filled with the quiet sounds and the quiet business of a morning getting itself started. But even at the simplest, even at the plainest, the point remained. The inner circle of chamber servants who were present in the room at this hour were not casual or interchangeable. They were the innermost layer of the great household, the men who had the most intimate access, which meant the most intimate trust, which meant a form of closeness that was the most private and most valued thing the household had to offer its members. The morning fire holds steady. The candles have burned down slightly from where they started. Beyond the window, the world is becoming light at last, and the first sounds of the household at large beginning its morning. A distant voice in the courtyard, a cart on the cobbles, the distant ring of a horse's shoe on stone, are coming through the thick walls as something more felt than heard. The king is up. The first ceremony of the day is done. And already behind him, the chamber servants are beginning the quiet work of setting the room to rights for the day, straightening the coverlets, drawing back the curtains on their rods, attending to the basin, replenishing the candles. The great bed of a state must be ready to be a stage again whenever it is next needed, because in this household nothing is ever left undressed for long. There is something worth noting about this whole morning world that the chamber represents, something that is easy to miss if you approach it from the outside. The chamber was not a space that existed simply to house the king during his private hours. It was the engine of a particular kind of royal power, the power of personal relationship, of known faces and established trust, of the intimacy that grew between a lord and the men who served him in his most unguarded moments. The men of the chamber were, in many medieval reigns, as politically important as the great officers of the wider court. They were the men who had the king's ear before anyone else did, the men who could raise a subject or suppress it at the most private, and therefore most persuasive moment of the day. This was understood at the time. The chroniclers and the political writers of the period return again and again to the question of who had access to the king's person, and why it mattered, and what dangers arose when the wrong men occupied the chamber. The medieval political literature about royal council is in large part a literature about the chamber, about who should be there, how their influence should be restrained, what it meant for the realm when a king surrounded himself in private with men who did not deserve the trust he extended to them. The chamber was, in the end, the most intimate government of the kingdom, the government that operated before the formal government convened, the government of the pillow and the mourning robe. And the men who ran it, who tended the fire and drew the curtains and held the ewer and passed the robe, were not performing tasks below the attention of history. They were performing tasks at the very center of it. The good news for a medieval king was that all of this attention and care was genuinely comfortable. The fire, the warm water, the robes, the organized mourning. The bad news was that no moment of it was private, and no part of it was improvised, and the comfortable life of a medieval king was comfortable in the way that a very well-run institution is comfortable, efficiently, attentively, and always in the presence of witnesses. You can feel this, a little, in the quality of the morning air in the chamber as the king finishes dressing and prepares to move to the chapel. The room has the warmth of a place that has been carefully tended, and the quiet of a place where important things happen without being announced. The fire holds its steady light. The single beeswax candle on the chest burns without a flicker. The door to the outer room stands slightly open, and through it comes the first sound of the wider household in its morning motion. Before the king can appear as a king, he must be made to look like one. The washing and dressing that occupy the first portion of the morning are as choreographed, in their way, as any of the ceremonies that will come later in the day. A careful, practiced sequence of actions performed by the right people in the right order, each contributing something specific to the result. What the king puts on his body is not simply clothing. It is a statement, read by everyone who sees him, about who he is and what he represents, and getting that statement right is important enough to be several people's entire professional livelihood. The washing comes first, and even this simplest of acts is offered with ceremony. A ewer of water, warmed in the well-ordered households, carried from the kitchen before it loses too much of its heat on a cold morning, is brought to the chamber along with a basin and a fine linen towel. At the grandest courts, even the most ordinary acts have their protocols. The ewer is carried by a man of rank, not a menial. The towel is held by someone else. The basin itself may be held by a third. The king washes his hands and his face. The water is received and taken away, and at every step of this sequence the men attending him are performing a service that their position in the household entitles them to perform, a service that carries in it the same principle that governs everything else in the chamber. To be close to the king's body is to hold a particular kind of honor. This is the Burgundian principle in its most visible form, that to attend the prince at his most private and personal moments was the greatest honor the court could offer. The logic is not difficult to follow once you understand the world it operates in. The man who was present in the chamber at the most intimate hour of the day was there before the formal audiences, before the council convened, before the great officers arrived with their papers and their demands. He was not an observer of the king's public role. He was a participant in the king's private person, and that participation translated in the world of the medieval court into the kind of relationship that could not be built anywhere else. The shirt comes next. In the later and more ceremonious courts, the clean linen shirt, the garment worn directly against the skin, the one that absorbed the body's own warmth and the residue of the night, was handed to the king through a chain of attendants, each one passing it to the next of slightly higher rank, until it arrived in the hands of the man who had the honour of placing it over the king's shoulders. This is what Olivier de la Marche meant when he described the shirt passing up a chain of rank, as though each pair of hands through which it moved was a rung of a ladder built entirely of deference and trust. The earlier English court was plainer in its forms, and it would be misleading to project the full Burgundian ceremony backward onto every earlier English morning. But the underlying principle held across the range. The king's chamber was not open to all comers, and the men permitted to be in it during the morning's private rituals were a small and chosen group whose presence expressed the king's confidence in them. In a world where confidence was the rarest and most consequential thing a great lord could extend, the morning chamber was where it was most fully given. After the washing, the dressing. The king's wardrobe. And here the word denotes not merely a room, but the whole administrative department responsible for his clothing, his furs, his beds, his hangings, his tents, his pavilions, and the detailed accounting of all of these, was one of the real governing institutions of the medieval royal household. The Great Wardrobe, as it came to be called in England, functioned as a storehouse, an accounting office, and at various periods a private treasury all at once. Clerks of the wardrobe recorded the receipt of new cloth from the merchants and its delivery to the tailors, the issue of finished robes to the king's use, the storage of furs against the moth and the damp, the full inventory of every valuable item under the wardrobe's responsibility. Nothing was left unrecorded. The king's clothes were a matter of state, and state matters were tracked by clerks. By today's standards, you would want a digital inventory system, a climate-controlled storage room, and a dedicated logistics platform to manage what the wardrobe handled with ledger books, locked chests, and trained clerks who knew exactly how many sable-lined robes were on the shelf and when the last set of ermine had been sent to the furrier for repair. The medieval solution was less convenient, but not less thorough. It is worth pausing on the robes themselves, because they are not simply expensive clothes. They are, in the common visual language of the medieval world, a statement that everyone who could see the king could read, whether or not they were able to read any other kind of writing. When you see the king dressed for the hall, you are reading that statement as clearly as anyone else in the room. The cloth matters. A king wore cloth of gold, silk thread woven through with actual gold, stiff and brilliant and costly beyond most people's imagining. He wore silks in deep, fast colours that did not fade with washing or sunlight, which was itself a mark of wealth, because cheap dyes ran and faded, and only the costly ones held their depth through the seasons. He wore the finest wools, the kind sold in the great wool markets at prices per yard that would be startling to any household accustomed to buying cloth by the bolt. By today's standards, the materials would seem impossibly heavy, impossibly warm, impossibly laborious to produce. No memory foam, no breathable synthetic fibre, and definitely no online wardrobe delivery arriving at the palace gate in a brown box. But in their place, a material culture of extraordinary richness and deliberate display, every yard of cloth and every strand of fur a declaration of the wearer's position and the dignity of his house. The furs matter even more than the cloth, and they form a precisely graded system of rank that any observer of the medieval court understood without instruction. Ermine, the white winter coat of the stoat with its distinctive scattered black tail tips, was reserved for royalty and the highest nobility, the king, the great princes, and the handful of magnates whose standing placed them at the very top of the hierarchy. Miniver, the white belly fur of the red squirrel, finer and softer than the rough outer coat, was a grade below, appropriate to lords and senior officers. Sable, the darkest and most expensive of the furs, carried its own prestige. Every functionary, every herald, every clerk who attended royal ceremonies knew how to read these materials. The fur on the king's collar was not decoration. It was information, precise, immediate, and universally understood in the world of the court, without any need for explanation or translation. The colour and the cut of the garments also communicated. What was called scarlet in this period was not merely a hue, but a grade of fine-dyed wool of the highest quality, cloth so good that it came to define the colour most often used to dye it. To wear scarlet was to wear cost and quality. To look at the king in his scarlet robe was to look at a man whose court could afford to dress him in the best the wool markets produced. Robes were also given as gifts, and this function of the royal wardrobe was not incidental. A king who gave a robe to a great lord, or a livery to a knight of his household, was using the wardrobe as a tool of political favour, clothing his followers, plainly and visibly, in his own colours and materials, so that they went about the realm wearing the statement of their attachment to the royal house. The gift of a robe was a public act, recorded in the accounts, and its reception was a public act of the same kind. The lord accepting the livery was accepting, in a visible form, the king's service and the king's identity. There is also the ring, slid onto the finger last, the cold metal warming quickly against the skin. The familiar weight of a stone in a gold setting. The ring is not merely jewellery, it is the king's signet, one of the instruments through which his authority will be expressed in writing later this morning, and wearing it is as much an act of office as an act of dress. The smell of the chamber in all this dressing is not a smell that survives in documents, but the imagination can supply it. Cedar and dried herbs from the stored furs, a faint sweet warmth that clung to cloth carefully kept in wooden chests, beeswax candles beginning to melt slowly in the morning warmth, the particular deep note of a fire burning in a stone hearth, and underneath all of these the clean linen smell of freshly laundered sheets being folded across the room by the chamber servants at their work. It was the smell of a life organised at considerable expense and care to be comfortable, dignified, and correct. The dressing complete, the king stands as a king. The robes settle around him with their weight, the wide sleeves, the fur at the hem and the cuff, the robe falling in heavy folds that have a gravity quite unlike modern clothes. He is, in the most literal possible sense, wearing his identity. And once worn, the robe does something to the wearer. This is not fanciful. It is what all clothing does, but the effect is magnified when the clothing is this specific and this loaded with meaning. The king who was, 5 minutes ago, a person sitting on the edge of a bed blinking at a candle, becomes, once the robes are properly in place, a figure that the room responds to differently. The chamber servants stand slightly more carefully. The air seems to organise itself. The groom who holds the door does so with a particular attentiveness. The robe is not merely a signal to other people. It is a signal to the king as well, a reminder, daily, physical, inescapable, of who he is and what he is required to be. The great wardrobe's clerks, meanwhile, have noted the day's issue in their accounts. The particular robe, the particular furs, the date, the occasion. These records were not kept for sentiment but for administration, to track the wear and the condition of the garments, to know when resupply of cloth or replacement of worn pieces was needed, to account for the considerable sums of money that the king's clothing represented. A royal household was an economic operation as much as a ceremonial one, and its books recorded everything. By today's standards, the level of record-keeping would seem like an eccentric luxury, to catalogue every robe worn, every candle burned, every loaf of bread issued to every officer. By the standards of a large medieval institution with hundreds of people to provision and account for, it was simply how you knew what was happening and kept the whole thing from dissolving into improvisation. Outside the chamber, the rest of the household is already well into the morning. The chapel is lit. The chaplain is ready. The council chamber is being prepared. The day, which has been waiting with characteristic patience for the king to be available to it, is now ready to begin. Before the king attends to any human business, he attends to God. The morning mass was not an optional refinement or a private indulgence that varied by the king's inclination on a given day. It was the first and non-negotiable appointment of every morning, the one commitment that preceded everything else, the council, the documents, the audiences, the hall, and its place at the very head of the day was not accidental. It announced to the king and to all who observed him what kind of world they were living in, one in which the authority of the secular ruler derived from the authority of God, and in which that derivation was acknowledged publicly and daily by the ruler himself kneeling in his chapel and submitting, before anything else was asked of him, to the liturgy of the church. The chapel royal was a department of the royal household, and it travelled with the king just as the wardrobe and the chamber and the kitchen and the marshalsea travelled with him. It had its own internal structure, a dean who oversaw the whole spiritual establishment of the king's personal household, a complement of chaplains and clerks of varying ranks and functions, and choristers whose voices were the chapel's most audible gift to the daily life of the court. When the court moved from palace to hunting lodge to castle, as it did regularly, particularly in the earlier medieval centuries when the king was expected to show himself across the breadth of his realm and to consume the food rents of each royal estate in turn, the chapel's portable equipment moved with it. The jewelled gospel books. The portable altar, small enough to set up in a tent on campaign or in a draughty upper room of a castle not designed for devotion. The vestments in their cases. The relics. The relics deserve a pause. By modern standards, a collection of small bones in gold cases and vials of oil in jewelled reliquaries would seem an unusual thing for a government institution to own, maintain, and travel with. But by the standards of the medieval world in which the king's authority was inseparable from his relationship with God, these objects were not curiosities. They were instruments of state, as functional in their way as the seals in their cases. The king's chapel accumulated, over time, a collection of sacred objects that made it one of the richest concentrations of holiness in the realm. Not a fixed collection, since relics moved and were acquired and given and received, but one that a pious king would actively augment through purchase, gift, and occasional inheritance. Kings collected relics as they collected land and allegiances, as instruments of spiritual power, as proofs of God's particular favor for their house, as physical anchors for the invisible claims they needed their subjects to accept. A splinter of the true cross in a jeweled case of gold and enamel. A vial of holy oil, sealed in glass. A fragment of a martyred saint's bone, mounted in a reliquary shaped like the part of the body it came from, so that its intercessory power was legible to anyone who saw it. These objects were not merely devotional. They were political, in the deepest medieval sense of that word. They were material evidence of the king's relationship with the sacred, and that relationship was the foundation of his legitimate authority. If you stood in the chapel when these objects were present and correctly arranged, you were standing in the most carefully curated sacred space in the kingdom. The king's place in the chapel expressed his piety and his dignity at the same time and in the same space. He did not worship as an ordinary member of the household worshipped, standing in the main body of the nave with his servants and his household officers. He had a private closet, a raised pew, an enclosed gallery above the nave, the exact arrangement varying by the particular palace and by the period, set apart so that he could hear the Mass with a degree of privacy and distinction while still being visible at the key moments as the first and highest subject of his realm at their common prayer. His piety was a public act of his office as much as a private act of his faith. When the king was seen to kneel, the whole court was watching, and the watching was not incidental to the act. It was, in some real sense, part of what the act accomplished. Imagine the chapel in the grey quiet of an early morning. The stone is cold in the particular way that stone in a high-ceilinged vault is cold. A chill that rises through the floor tiles regardless of how many candles are burning above. By modern standards, you would want central heating in a space this large, or at least insulation adequate to the season. There is none of either, only the candles and the incense and the warmth of the bodies present, which is enough, or is treated as enough, because it is what there is. And there are many candles, in their brackets on the nave walls, on the altar itself, in the tall candlesticks that flank the crucifix at the east end, and their combined light falls onto the gold of the altarware, the gilded frame of the painted reredos behind the altar, the jeweled cover of the gospel book lying flat on its cushion. The light is warm in its quality, even when the air is not, and in the centre of the chapel the incense rises from the censer in a thin, sweet thread, carrying its blue-grey haze upward toward the vault, filling the cold air with a smell that is at once ancient and daily, always the same and always the specific scent of this particular morning. The chaplain's voice is low. The Latin of the Mass moves through its familiar sequence. Introitus, Kyrie, Gloria, Epistola, Evangelium, Credo, with the particular rhythmic assurance of words said so many thousands of times that they have become inseparable from the act of saying them. This is not the rote of boredom. It is the deep groove of long practice, the way a thing becomes fluent, becomes the texture of a day rather than an item on a list. The king has heard these words every morning of his adult life and most of his childhood. They are as familiar as his own breathing. The king kneels at his prie-dieu, the small cushioned desk designed for the purpose. He has knelt here, or at a desk very like this one in a chapel very like this one, every morning he can remember. The prayers are the same prayers. The responses are the same responses. The rhythm of the Mass is the rhythm of the day's opening, a structure so deeply habitual that to omit it would feel less like skipping a religious duty than like waking to find the sun had not risen and the morning had no shape. This is what a daily practice becomes over a lifetime, the architecture of the day itself, indistinguishable from the structure of time. A genuinely devout king. And there were genuinely devout medieval kings, men for whom the morning Mass was a source of real consolation and genuine spiritual attention rather than a correct political performance, might attend more than one Mass on an ordinary day. Henry I of England is remembered in the household records as a man who heard more than the minimum as a matter of regular habit. Some kings heard several offices a day as a matter of course, spending a substantial portion of the morning in the chapel in a sequence of prayers and readings that their more secularly occupied counterparts compressed into a single, efficient service. The daily Mass was the floor, not the ceiling, of what a pious king owed to God. The household records give a partial picture of how the morning devotions fitted into the day's sequencing, though reconstructing the precise timing is not always straightforward. The documents record what was done, less often in what order or for precisely how long. What is clear is the general shape: prayer in the bedchamber on rising, then a move to the chapel for Mass, which might be a private low Mass said quietly by a single chaplain, or a more elaborate sung service with the full complement of the Chapel Royal's choristers. The duration was correspondingly different. A private low Mass could be over in 30 or 40 minutes. A sung high Mass with all its ceremonies might take an hour and a half or more. A king for whom the chapel was a genuine refuge and not merely an appointment would have experienced those extra hours very differently from one who was simply marking the minimum. The relics in their cases caught the candlelight from different angles as the chaplain moved through the liturgy. The gold of the settings, the red glow of garnets, the particular lustre of enamel in candlelight, which is not the same as enamel in daylight, being warmer and richer and more alive. A king at prayer in his own chapel, with his own relics and his own chaplains and his own particular relationship with the saints whose presence was concentrated in these objects, was in a space made specifically and entirely for him, in a world that was otherwise almost never entirely his alone. The chapel was the most private public space he had. After the Mass, there might be private prayer. A period of personal devotion after the liturgy ended, longer or shorter depending on the king's inclination and the morning's demands. A confessor might be consulted. A brief, specific silence kept. And then the king would rise from his prie-dieu and turn and walk out of the chapel into the rest of the morning. The candles went on burning behind him. The chaplain completed the final prayers of the Mass. The incense smoke dissipated slowly in the cold vault above. The empty chapel held its particular quality of silence. The silence of a room in which something important had just been completed and had left its presence behind. And outside, in the great house around the chapel, The morning had already been in full motion for some time. The council chamber was ready. The clerks were at their desks. The day's accumulation of writs and rolls and petitions was already building. The King's Mass had been the first fixed point of the morning, and now the second was approaching. The quiet room and the men with the pens and the seals and the kingdom's business to translate into the written instruments of royal will. It is worth pausing before we leave the chapel entirely on what the Chapel Royal was as an institution, not only as a place of worship, but as a department of the household with its own internal logic and its own particular position in the social world of the court. The men of the Chapel Royal were not simply clerics performing a service. They were a skilled professional body, trained in music and liturgy, and the management of sacred objects and ceremonial space, whose work was the daily maintenance of the king's spiritual household, just as the wardrobe's clerks maintained his material household. A king with a well-run Chapel Royal had a resource that extended beyond the morning mass into the wider ceremonial life of the court. The solemn requiems for the dead, the Te Deums of victory, the formal high masses of the great feast days, the music that filled the hall on occasions when music was part of what the occasion required. The choristers of the Chapel Royal were sometimes among the finest musicians in the realm, sought out and recruited with care, trained by the dean and the leading chaplains in the sophisticated polyphonic music of the period. By the later Middle Ages, the Chapel Royal had become in England an institution of real musical distinction, and the music that the king heard at his morning mass was not simple plain chant, but layered, intricate, beautiful. A gift of sound that the church had learned over centuries to make from human voices and the particular acoustics of a stone vault. No recorded choir, no amplification, and definitely no streaming the morning service to a phone. Just voices trained over years to fill a stone space with sound, and the sound itself doing the rest. There was also the question of what the king owed the chapel in return for what the chapel gave him. The obligation was not merely attendance. It included the maintenance of the chapel's fabric, the repair of the building, the provision of vestments and altar-ware and candles, and the support of the chantry foundations that a pious king endowed so that prayers would be said in perpetuity for his soul and the souls of his family. The spiritual economy of the medieval world ran on prayer, and prayer had to be funded and housed and staffed, and the king, who had the most resources and the most need of intercession, was the natural founder of the greatest prayerful institutions. After Mass, the work. Not the work of dramatic confrontation, not the high-stakes decision-making of crisis moments. The governing of an ordinary morning was quieter and considerably more administrative than the chronicles suggest when they describe the great turning points of history. If you could have walked through a medieval palace on an ordinary morning in the hour after the king's chapel and found the room where the day's governing was being done, you would not have found anything resembling the scenes of high drama. You would have found clerks, men at desks, parchment and wax and quills and rolls, the scratch of writing in a warm room, a small fire, the careful sound of a large organization doing its paperwork. The clerks were the real machinery of medieval royal government, and it is worth spending a moment with them before attending to the more visible apparatus of the seal. They were educated men, educated in Latin, in the formal administrative hand of their training, in the formulas and conventions of royal correspondence that did not change greatly from decade to decade, because the whole point of a formula was its stability and its recognizability. A writ issued under Henry I looked different in its specific language and physical appearance from one issued under Henry III, but both were products of the same basic training in the same basic art, the translation of the king's will into written form in the correct form with the correct authority attached to it. The writ had to look like a writ. The charter had to look like a charter. Otherwise, the whole system of written authority on which the kingdom rested began to lose its traction. The Chancery was the great writing office of the realm, the department responsible for the king's letters, writs, and charters, the formal instruments by which the king commanded his officers across the country, granted his favours, issued his judgments, and conducted business with the world beyond the palace walls. The clerks of the Chancery worked in a deliberate, professional, standardised hand. Not a natural handwriting, but a trained performance, produced the same way by every man trained in the office, so that a document produced by the Chancery could be recognised as such by anyone who knew what a Chancery document looked like. Consistency was the point. The kingdom ran on writing, and that writing had to be trustworthy from a distance, in the hands of a sheriff or a castle keeper, or a bailiff who might never meet the king, or any of the clerks who wrote the document in his name. Picture yourself as one of these clerks, on an ordinary morning in the council chamber's antechamber, your desk by the window, the light coming in at an angle that is adequate in summer and insufficient in winter. You have no typewriter, no computer, and definitely no autocorrect when the pen slips and the wrong letter lands on the parchment, wet and uncorrectable in the first seconds before the ink dries. Your training took years, and it shows in the hand. The same careful, unhurried script that every Chancery clerk produced, the government's recognisable face on paper. Your morning will involve copying, checking, and sealing perhaps a dozen writs. Some of them will travel 20 miles. Some will travel 200. Each one carries the king's will into the world and must do so correctly, because an incorrect writ is a writ that does not work, and a writ that does not work is a failure of the government's reach. By today's standards, you would want a spreadsheet, a shared document system, a secure digital signature, and definitely no wax that takes 3 minutes to cool before you can fold the thing. But the medieval system, with its trained hands and its standardized forms and its hierarchy of seals, achieved something genuinely equivalent. A kingdom-wide administrative communication network that functioned across illiterate distances through the combination of written text and visual authentication. The writ was the instrument of royal will. It was a short sealed letter, a single sheet of parchment, written in Latin or French or later in English, folded and sealed, addressed to a named official or class of official, commanding a specific action. The sheriff receives a writ and must hold a court. The keeper of a castle receives a writ and must release a prisoner. The bailiff of a manor receives a writ directing him to render account of his receipts. The esciator receives a writ ordering him to take an estate into the king's hand. The range of what writs could command was effectively the range of what the king's authority could reach, which was, in theory, everything in the realm. The kingdom was governed in its daily administrative reality not by the king riding around personally issuing commands, but by the steady, continuous flow of these small written documents out of the writing offices and into the hands of the men responsible for executing them. The writ was what made it possible to govern a large and scattered territory from a single moving point. It was the king's will, portable and durable, able to travel where he could not. By today's standards, the system was slow. A week or more for a document to travel from the palace to a distant county, and the lack of any way to confirm receipt or follow up without sending another document entirely was a constant practical problem. No email delivery receipt, no courier tracking, no electronic signature waiting to be acknowledged. What the system had instead was the accumulated weight of custom, obligation, and the knowledge that a king's sealed writ was not a request. It was a command. The seals that authenticated these documents were as important as the words they authenticated, because without the seal, a document was simply parchment with writing on it, and anyone might write anything. A seal was the king's signature in a world where the great majority of people could not read letters, and where the visual impression of a known die pressed into wax communicated authority as clearly and immediately as a face. The Great Seal, kept by the Chancellor, who was the head of the Chancery and one of the great officers of the realm, was a large double-sided die that pressed the king's image in majesty on one face and his arms and mounted image on the other into the hot wax, creating the great pendant seal attached to the most solemn and binding documents. The image on it was precise and recognizable. The king enthroned on one side, on horseback in the field on the other, the legend running around the circumference of both giving his name and titles in abbreviated Latin. To see that seal on a document was to know, immediately and without any need to read the words above it, that the highest formal authority of the realm stood behind whatever was written there. But the Great Seal was cumbersome in its use. The Chancellor who kept it was a great officer of the realm with many other responsibilities and might not be immediately available. Its use required a degree of formality and process that slower or more personal or more urgent business could not always wait for. As a result, as the medieval centuries progressed and the volume of royal business increased, kings developed smaller and more personal seals for different purposes and different levels of business. The Privy Seal, held by the king's own keeper of the Privy Seal, could authenticate less formal documents more quickly and more directly than the Great Seal could. And the signet, the smallest and most personal seal, kept in the king's own ring or by his personal secretary, could authenticate the most immediate and personal commands and correspondence without the full machinery of the Chancery being set in motion at all. By the 14th century, a letter under the king's signet could set the Privy Seal in motion, and the Privy Seal in turn could instruct the Chancery to issue documents under the Great Seal, a chain of authentication that allowed the king to act quickly and personally while still ensuring that, when the chain was complete, the most formal and binding authority of the realm was properly invoked. The hierarchy of seals was a hierarchy of urgency and formality, a carefully designed administrative instrument for roting the king's will through the appropriate level of official process. Imagine the moment the seal is applied to a finished writ. The wax, warmed in a small vessel near the fire until it is soft and ready, is pressed or poured against the folded and tied document. The die, A beautifully made object of bronze or silver, engraved by a skilled craftsman with the king's image, a piece of genuine art in miniature, is pressed into the warm wax with firm, deliberate, even pressure, held for a count of slow breaths, then lifted. The impression is precise, the image clear, the king in majesty, the arms of his house, the legend around the edge. A ribbon of parchment threaded through a slit cut in the lower edge of the document holds the seal pendant once the wax cools and sets. The document is rolled, tied, addressed. It is ready to travel. One real document gives a sense of how thoroughly this world was organized and committed to paper. The Constitutio Domus Regis, the establishment of the king's household, written in England around 1136, compiled probably for the new King Stephen from the practices of his predecessor Henry I, set out the daily allowances due to every officer of the royal household in extraordinary detail. The Chancellor's 5 shillings a day, plus specified quantities of bread, wine, and candles. The stewards 4 shillings and their allowances. The lesser officers their own precisely graded shares all the way down to the grooms and the watchmen. This was not a theoretical document. It was a practical administrative handbook, and its existence tells you something important. That the medieval royal household was not governed by tradition and memory alone, but by written rules, recorded in documents, updated by new documents when circumstances changed. The paperwork of kingship was as real as any of the ceremonies. The council itself, the king's principal advisers, meeting in the council chamber to hear business and offer their counsel, fitted into the morning schedule differently depending on the day and the press of particular affairs. On some mornings the king heard the council before the seal work began. On others the sessions overlapped. On others the council's business was entirely administrative, the king receiving brief reports and issuing decisions that a clerk noted and then translated into the appropriate documentary form. The distance from the king's spoken word to the sheriff's received writ was small in terms of the process, but large in terms of the geography it crossed. A word spoken in the council chamber in the morning might, within a week, be affecting the behaviour of a bailiff 200 miles away who had never seen the king and never would. When the court was on the move, as it regularly was, particularly in the earlier medieval centuries when the itinerant life of the king was both an economic necessity and a demonstration of royal presence, the whole writing office packed up and moved with it. The rolls of previous business, the formularies with their model letters, the seals in their carrying cases, all of it on the pack horses, travelling along the same road as the king, so that the government arrived wherever the king arrived. The government was the household, and the household moved. The volume of business that passed through the royal writing offices in a busy reign was considerable. Historians who have counted the writs enrolled on the chancery rolls of the 13th century English kings have found hundreds issued in a single day during the busiest periods. The clerks kept pace. They had to. On campaign, in a hunting lodge, at a great feast, after a victory or before a difficult negotiation, the writs went on being written and sealed, the rolls went on being kept, the machinery of written administration continued its patient, unglamorous, essential work. There is something worth noting about this, not in the sense of astonishing or beyond expectation, but in the sense of worth sitting with for a moment and holding steady in the mind. The The dozen or so clerks in a warm room somewhere in a palace or a castle, producing in their trained and standardized hands the documents that held the kingdom together. No rapid communication, no duplicated file, no automated signature process, and definitely no recovery system for the rolls if the archive chest slipped from the pack horse into a river ford. Just parchment and wax and pen and the dedicated application of trained men doing one thing well, day after day, in whatever conditions the king's travels imposed on them. The finished document was the government's reach into the world. The clerk's trained hand was what made that reach possible. The council chamber itself was typically a room of moderate and workmanlike size, furnished with a table or benches appropriate to a working group, hung with cloth against the cold of the stone walls, with a fireplace against the season. The great officers sat in their positions of precedence. The king sat at the head. The clerks were at the edges of the room, noting what was said and what was decided. The business came in, was discussed, was decided, was recorded, and went out in the form of instructions to the appropriate officer. The whole process was quiet, purposeful, and unremarkable from the outside, which is to say it was the quiet centre of everything that mattered about how the medieval kingdom worked from day to day. The kingdom, on any given day, is the household. That is the quiet thesis at the centre of this episode, and it is worth pausing on it directly and plainly before moving through the offices and departments that made it work. In the medieval world, there was no clean administrative line between the king's domestic establishment and the government of the realm. The men who governed were the men who served. The offices that controlled proximity to the royal person and directed the resources of his household were the same offices, in their origins and in many cases in their continued operation, that handled the public affairs of the kingdom. The chamberlain who held the key to the royal bedchamber also, in earlier centuries, controlled the royal treasury. The wardrobe, which stored and accounted for the king's personal possessions, became at various periods a major engine of royal finance. The household and the government were not two things. They were one thing, seen from two angles. This was not a confusion or an accident of administrative underdevelopment. It was the deliberate structure of a world in which authority was personal, in which governing meant being near the king, and in which the distinction between the domestic and the political was not yet available to be drawn, because the king's body and the king's office were not yet understood as separable. The household was the government, not as a metaphor, but as a literal administrative fact. By the 13th century, as the administrative machinery of the kingdom grew more complex and more specialized, a degree of separation was beginning to develop. A more formal public government of great common law courts and the chancery and the exchequer existed alongside the more personal household government of the chamber and the wardrobe. But even then, even as the distinction gradually clarified through legislation and institutional development, the household remained the inner engine of royal power. The great officers of the household were not ceremonial figures. They were real administrators. The household itself, at any given moment in the High or later Middle Ages, was a large and complex institution whose size varied considerably by reign, by occasion, and by the phase of the court's settled or travelling life. An English royal household in the high medieval period ran to several hundred people on an ordinary day. On major ceremonial occasions, a great feast, a coronation, a royal wedding, it could swell to considerably more. The later medieval courts, and particularly the Burgundian establishment of the 15th century, with its elaborate and deliberately ceremonious organisation, ran larger still, and with a more precisely defined internal structure. The Black Book of Edward IV, a detailed household ordinance compiled in the early 1470s as part of the process leading toward the full ordinance of 1478, describes a household organised across dozens of named offices, with precise numbers of men assigned to each and precise rates of pay and daily allowances specified for every grade. A. R. Myers, who produced the standard modern edition of the Black Book and the 1478 Ordinance, noted the extraordinary specificity of the document. It was an administrative blueprint for a household understood as a serious institution, not a casual domestic arrangement. At the top of the pyramid stood the great officers, whose titles and specific responsibilities shifted somewhat across the centuries and between different kingdoms, but whose broad functions were broadly consistent. The steward, the dapifer, the dish-bearer, in the Latin of the early records, was the head of the hall and of the household below stairs. He was responsible for the great hall as a social and physical institution, for its being fed, managed, and properly ordered, for the reception of the whole household at its daily common meals, for the conduct of the king's hospitality to guests of all ranks. In England, by the high medieval period, the title of Lord High Steward had become largely ceremonial in its actual daily function. The practical domestic work distributed among deputies and under-stewards. But the prestige of the office was immense, and its original function was real. The hall was the public face of the royal household, and the steward was responsible for what happened there. The chamberlain controlled the chamber, the king's private rooms, and therefore controlled who came near the royal person. This was the office whose holder was physically nearest the king in the intimate domestic world of the morning and the evening, in the private hours before and after the public day. The chamberlain's practical function was the management of the private life of the household, but his political function was gatekeeping in the most consequential sense. He determined who could come into the presence, who was kept waiting in the outer rooms, who was admitted to the inner chamber, and at what moments and in what circumstances. In a world where access to the king was the most sought-after thing at court, the chamberlain's power was not merely ceremonial. It was real, and it was exercised constantly. The treasurer or keeper of the wardrobe managed the money. The private financial resources of the household, distinct from the public revenues of the realm and from the exchequer that administered them. In the more activist royal regimes of the 13th and 14th centuries, the wardrobe served as a major financial engine in its own right, providing the king with flexible and responsive funds that bypassed the slower machinery of the public exchequer. The wardrobe's clerks kept their own accounts, received and dispersed their own funds, and the keeper of the wardrobe was sometimes one of the most important financial officials in the kingdom, operating as a kind of private central bank for the king's personal and immediate requirements. The marshal controlled the horses, the logistics of the court's movement, the quartering of the household when it was on the road, and the general order and discipline of the travelling establishment. In a world where the court moved regularly between royal residences, and an active English king of the 12th or 13th century might travel hundreds of miles in a year, consuming the resources of one estate before moving to the next. The marshal's job was the practical management of a large and complicated organization on the march. Advance parties, pack horses and carts, the fodder for the horses, the question of who slept where on the road, the supply of provisions in places where the household's arrival had not always been fully anticipated or prepared for. Below these great officers, the hierarchy descended through a long series of lesser ones. The knights of the household, the esquires, and the sergeants of the various departments, the yeomen and grooms and pages who performed the actual daily work of serving the king's table and tending his body and caring for his horses. The precise hierarchy of these ranks varied by century and by kingdom, and it would be misleading to present any one court's particular structure as a universal system. The household of Henry was a different institution from that of Edward III, which was different again from the Burgundian household of Philip the Good. What was consistent across all of them was the principle that every level had its designated role, its designated allowances, and its designated people. The functional departments of the household below stairs operated as distinct specialist workshops, each under its own officer with its own complement of staff. The kitchen prepared the food. The buttery managed the ale and wine. The pantry oversaw the bread. The cellar kept the stored wines and provisions. The spicery held the locked store of spices and expensive confections. The saffron, the pepper, the cinnamon, the ginger, all the aromatic materials that were expensive enough to require secure storage and careful accounting. The scullery washed the vessels. The saucery prepared the sauces and condiments. The larder maintained the stored meats. The bakehouse managed the ovens and the bread production. The chandlery, perhaps the most consistently fascinating of these offices to modern eyes, managed the supply of candles for the entire household, beeswax for the upper household, tallow for the lower. The Constitutio Domus Regis of around 1136 itemized all of these allowances with a precision that strikes any modern reader who encounters it. One of its most telling details is the careful grading of the light allowances. The great officers of the household burned beeswax candles at night, which gave a clean, sweet, smoke-free light, the light itself a visible and daily mark of the standing of the position they held. The lesser officers burned tallow, which smokes and smells and blackens the wall above it. By today's standards, the difference might seem a minor amenity. By the standards of a medieval world in which light was laborious and rationed and loaded with meaning, the candle you burned each evening was a statement about who you were, as legible to any observer as the fur on your robe or the grade of bread on your table. You can think of the chandlery's careful grading as a kind of distributed temperature and light system. No central heating, no electric lighting, just a precise hierarchy of beeswax and tallow distributed by rank throughout the building each evening, the quality of your light a daily declaration of where you stood. The Black Book of Edward IV approached all of this from the later end of the medieval period with even more elaborate specificity. It laid out the household structure office by office, described the duties of each in considerable detail, specified the allowances of food and drink and candles due to officers of each rank, and set out the correct procedure for dozens of everyday actions: the serving of the king's cup, the arrangement of the hall tables, the conduct of the morning levee. household the size of the royal household could not function on custom and memory alone. It required documentation. It required clerks. And in requiring documentation and clerks, it became, in its own internal life, a kingdom of paper as much as a kingdom of persons. There is a further dimension to the household that the list of officers and departments does not quite capture, and it is worth dwelling on it before we leave this subject. The household was also a school. The young men who served in it, as pages, as esquires of the household, as gentlemen attendants in the chamber, were not merely performing duties. They were being formed. The household of a great lord was the standard educational institution for the sons of the nobility and the greater gentry in the medieval period. A boy was sent to a lord's household at 7 or 8 years old, not because his family could not care for him, but because the household was where the skills and the attitudes and the knowledge appropriate to a man of his future station were learned. He learned to ride, to hunt, to handle a hawk, to manage accounts, to conduct himself at table and in the chamber, to perform music, to speak French and enough Latin for the documents his future would require. He learned, above all, what a large and complex institution felt like from the inside, how it was organized, how it moved, what was expected of each person within it, how authority worked in practice. The boy who entered the household of a great lord and served there for 5 or 7 years emerged, if he had attended to his education, as a man capable of running a similar household of his own, or of serving in one at a higher level, because he had spent his formative years watching and participating in how such a thing worked. The royal household was the largest and most elaborate such school in the realm. To be placed in it was a mark of the highest favour for a family. To serve there well was the beginning of the most consequential careers. The great officers of subsequent generations were trained there. The men who would govern the realm in the next reign were formed there. The household was not only the government of the present day, it was the nursery of the government of the future. You can feel the weight of all this when you think about the hundreds of people who were, on any ordinary day, moving through the palace complex in the performance of their various roles. You can think of the medieval royal household, at its most expansive, as a self-replenishing institution, the king at its centre, the great officers managing its major departments, the lesser officers managing those departments' day-to-day work, the servants doing the work itself, and the young men in formation learning how to do all of it in preparation for the day when they would take their turn in one of the higher positions. No corporate HR department, no induction training programs, and definitely no org chart on the wall of the council chamber. But a system nonetheless, running on custom and ordinance and the accumulated knowledge of how things were done, reliable enough to outlast any individual and to go on functioning even in the complicated interregna between one king's death and another's coronation. The household was, in the end, bigger than any single king. It was the institution that held the kingdom's daily life together while the kings came and went. By mid-morning the great hall is ready, and the readying of it has been going on since before the chamber fire was even lit. The hall is the largest room in the palace complex, a long, high-roofed space with stone or timber walls, a central hearth or a wall fireplace that has been burning since dawn, and the floor strewn with fresh rushes laid early that morning by the servants whose specific job it is. The walls may be hung with tapestries, erasers of woven wool depicting hunting scenes, or heraldic patterns or stories from scripture or romance, the great ones worth considerable sums and serving as insulation as much as decoration, keeping the warmth in and the damp cold of the stone walls at a remove. At the far end, on the dais, the low raised platform that lifts the high table above the level of the hall floor, stands the cloth of estate, a canopy of embroidered fabric, suspended above and behind the king's own seat at the centre of the high table, marking his place even before he arrives. The cloth of estate is not merely a decorative canopy. It is a sign, as visible and immediate as the fur on his robe or the seal on his writs, of where sovereignty sits in this room. When the hall is full and the king has not yet entered, the cloth of estate over the empty chair tells every person in the room exactly what the arrangement of the space is and what it means. The king is not one among several at the high table. He is the point around which the high table, and therefore the whole hall, is organized. The hall is set out by rank, and this principle of seating by rank is the fundamental organizing logic of the medieval great house's social life. It governs everything from the arrangement of the tables, to the grade of the bread, to the richness of the wine, to the number of dishes brought to each table. The high table on the dais is for the king and the greatest members of his household and any honoured guests. The men who belong, by their established standing, at the nearest possible remove from the king. The tables running down the hall beneath it are for the household in descending order of precedence. Knights above esquires, esquires above yeomen, yeomen above grooms, the gradations continuing until they reach the far end of the hall and the humblest servants who eat there. To sit at the high table was a mark of status as significant as any other marker in the household's social vocabulary. To sit near the high table, within clear sight of the king's face, was a lesser but real mark. The hall at dinner mapped the hierarchy of the household across the physical space of the room so that anyone entering could read, at a glance and without any explanation, the social structure of the court and where any given person stood within it. Before the food there is the hand-washing, and the hand-washing is a ceremony with its own appointed officers and its own careful sequence. The ewerer, the officer specifically responsible for the ewer, the basin, and the fine linen towels used for hand-washing at the king's table, approaches the high table and pours water over the king's hands from the ewer into the basin held below. This is a service that is simultaneously a gesture of trust. The water has been carried to the table through a chain of hands, each link of which is accountable to the household. The king dries his hands on the offered towel. Down the hall, similar washing is performed at the lower tables, more quickly and with less ceremony, but following the same basic form. Every table in the hall washes before it eats. The service of the king's table is conducted by officers of the household, not by anonymous serving men. The carver, who stands at the king's elbow and cuts the food as it arrives, is a man trained in the carver's craft as part of the complete gentlemanly education expected in a great household. A skill alongside riding and music, and the management of a hawk, and the proper conduct of a person in a lord's company, all of them aspects of the same broad cultural formation. The cupbearer attends the king's wine and ensures the cup is always filled and presented correctly. The panter oversees the bread, the fine white manchette bread of the high table, made from the most carefully bolted flour, distinct in its whiteness and its lightness from the coarser loaves that appear at the lower tables. The butler manages the drink for the household at large. These are ancient offices. The men who hold them take their precedence from the office as much as from any personal standing they might bring to it. There is also the assay. Before the king's food or drink is placed before him, it is tasted by the officer, whose specific role includes this act of ceremonial protection. The credence, the tasting of the king's cup and dishes before they reach him, was a feature of royal service that combined genuine practical concern with a deeper symbolic resonance. The logic of poison was present in medieval court life in a way that a more settled and legally certain world might not fully appreciate. Courts were places of concentrated power and therefore of concentrated resentment, and the fear of deliberate harm was not irrational. But the assay was also, as scholars of court ceremonial have noted, a performance of the household's devotion, a visible enactment of the idea that the household stood between the king's person and the dangerous world, interposing its own bodies and its own faithfulness as a living protection. The king did not eat until someone he trusted had eaten before him. The ceremony was as much about trust as about toxicology. The food arrives from the kitchen in procession, and the procession is itself a ceremony, brief and observed. The meal ahead may last for 2 or 3 hours of courses and service and ceremony in a hall with no aspirin in any chest and no quiet exit door that does not require navigating the length of the room in plain sight of everyone present. You eat what arrives, at the pace the service sets, and you do so in full view of the household. The hall comes to a particular quality of attentive quiet as the dishes are brought in. Through the screens passage at the end of the hall, carried by the servants of the kitchen in their sequence, and the household's attention orients briefly toward the ritual of receiving the meal. This is not a practical necessity. Food does not require ceremony to move from one room to another. The ceremony is an announcement that what is about to happen is not merely a biological event, but a social one, and a significant one, and that it deserves the attentive recognition of the assembled household. The meal is taken together. The high table served first, the lower tables following in their precedence, the room filling with the sounds of a large company eating together in the moderate key that great house manners required. To eat together in the hall, in your correct place, with the king visible at the head of the room, was to participate in the daily renewal of the social order. The hall at dinner was the household made visible to itself, the hierarchy enacted, the community affirmed, the day's distribution of honour confirmed in the arrangement of the room and the order in which the dishes arrived. The almoner is also present, at the edges of the hall's proceedings, attending quietly to his work. The royal almoner, the king's officer charged with the management of the king's charity, gathered a portion of the meal's abundance during the service of the hall, an alms dish set aside, a quantity of food directed away from the tables toward the gate, where the poor who had gathered there by custom would receive it at the meal's end. This was not an improvised kindness or a variable indulgence. It was built into the ceremony of the meal as deliberately and as formally as the cloth of estate or the assay, because the king's charity was as much an expression of his office as any of the other rituals of the table. A king who did not give was not performing kingship correctly in the medieval understanding. any more than a king who did not attend Mass or who did not hear petitions. The generosity of the hall was structural. After the meal, the hall was cleared, the trestle tables removed, the cloths folded, the floor sweepers attending to the rushes, and the room returned to its function as a large and general space awaiting the next occasion. The king, having dined and washed his hands at the meal's end and perhaps taken a last cup, moved through into the afternoon. The food itself communicated as precisely as the robes and the seating. The high table received the finest cuts from the best prepared dishes, the whitest bread, the most carefully spiced sauces, the wine from the best casks in the cellar. The middle tables received their own grades of the same. The lower end of the hall was fed with bread that was coarser, dishes that were plainer, ale where the upper tables had wine. Every step down the hall corresponded to a step down in the material quality of what arrived on the table before you. By today's standards, this visible, graded, daily enactment of social hierarchy in the form of food quality might seem a pointed and even uncomfortable thing to be part of. But in the medieval hall, it was simply the order of things made legible in the most daily and the most universal of forms, the sharing of food. And everyone in the room understood the grammar of the distribution without requiring an explanation. The great hall as an institution deserves one more moment of attention, because it was more than a room where the household ate. It was the physical expression of the household's social contract, the daily, visible, embodied demonstration that the king fed his people and his people served him, that the relationship between lord and household was not merely contractual but communal, enacted each day in the shared ritual of the common table. In an earlier period, when a great lord genuinely ate in his hall with his full household every day, the hall was the central social institution of the great house in a way that later, more private courts sometimes softened. The move toward more private dining, more retired meals in the king's chamber rather than in the open hall, was a gradual development of the later medieval and early modern period. A shift away from the public communal eating of the high medieval great house towards something more private, more comfortable, and, to many observers of the time, more concerning. The hall was where the household was one thing together, and the king who withdrew from it into his private apartments took something of himself away from the daily life of the community around him. If you had eaten your dinner in the great hall as a member of that household, in your correct place, in your correct rank, you had been part of something larger than a meal. There was also the matter of what eating together in the hall communicated to the wider world. Guests who came to the king's court, ambassadors, foreign dignitaries, great lords presenting themselves in person, merchants with business to transact, were received in the hall and seated according to their standing, and the meal they received was a performance of the king's wealth and magnificence as clearly as any formal ceremony. To dine at a king's high table was to understand, through direct sensory experience, what the king's court was, the quality of the food, the skill of the service, the number and the elegance of the officers, the great candlesticks on the cloth of estate above the king's place, the particular silver or gold of the salt cellar, the quality of the wine. All of it communicated. All of it was meant to. The hall was the king's face to the world, and the world was watching. After dinner, the king is allowed to be, for a little while, something closer to a private person than he has been all morning. The afternoon was the portion of the day in which recreation was possible, and for a medieval king, recreation almost always began, when the weather and the season permitted, by going outside. The royal forest was not a park in any modern sense of that word. It was a legal jurisdiction, a vast territory of land kept specifically for the king's hunting under a strict and separately administered body of law that protected the deer and the trees and the other inhabitants of the forest against interference from any quarter, and imposed serious penalties on those who took deer or damaged the vert without the king's explicit permission. A royal forest might encompass many thousands of acres across several counties. It had its own officers, the chief foresters, the sub-foresters, the verderers who sat the forest courts, the agisters who managed the pasture of the forest's livestock, and its own judicial apparatus. To ride into the royal forest on a fine afternoon was to enter a space that existed, in a genuine and specific legal sense, for this purpose, the king's pleasure and exercise. Picture the party assembling in the stable yard when the king is going out. The horses are brought up, not the destrier, the costly and carefully maintained warhorse kept mostly idle in his box for the rare occasion that genuinely demanded him, but the riding palfreys, the smooth-gaited horses bred for a long afternoon on the road or in the forest, comfortable and responsive and trained for the chase. The huntsmen are ready with the hounds on their couples. The horns are carried by the hunt servants. The king mounts, and the party moves out through the gate. And then there is that particular moment of transition that everyone who has spent a long morning in a stone palace knows. The sky opening above, the air moving against your face, the sense of a world that does not stop at any ceiling. Hunting was the king's great outdoor recreation, the pursuit that was also exercise, also a near ritual performance of the qualities that royalty was supposed to embody in all its activities. The patience to follow a deer through its habitual range, learning its patterns. The decisiveness to commit to a run at the right moment, when the ground and the wind and the position of the hounds all aligned. The authority to direct a large and complicated operation of people and animals toward a common end without confusion or wasted effort. These were qualities a king was supposed to demonstrate, and the forest was the arena in which demonstrating them was socially appropriate and valued. The hunt required preparation that had begun before dawn. The huntsman had been reading the ground and the signs since early morning, following the tracks and the slots and the marks left by the quarry in the wet ground, locating where the deer had been feeding and where it had settled in the wood, bringing back their report to the master of the hunt in time for the company to plan its approach. By the time the king mounted in the stable yard, the morning's scouting work had already been done, and the forest ahead was known in its essential features before anyone rode into it. Hawking was the other great outdoor pleasure, and it suited the afternoon in a different way from the hunt. Where the hunt was a large and noisy and sociable affair, hawking was smaller, more intimate, more immediately concentrated on the single moment of the bird's flight. The hawk, hooded and still on the king's gloved fist, its jesses looped through the fingers, its weight a familiar and specific thing, was carried out to the open ground, the riverbank, the edge of the marsh where the quarry was likely to fly. The hood came off. The bird launched into the air, gained height with the rapid, purposeful climbing of a trained hunting bird, and for a brief moment the whole afternoon gathered itself into the arc of a single creature against the sky, and everything else fell back and became simply the ground that the flight required. But the afternoon was not always fine, and the king was not always young or in good enough health for an afternoon in the saddle across open country. On a wet day, or in the shorter afternoons of winter, or in the later quiet of an early evening that had not yet darkened enough to call for candles but had lost the energy for the outdoor life, the recreation moved indoors. And the indoor leisure of the medieval court had its own pleasures, its own rhythms, its own particular quality of rest. The chessboard was a natural occupation for an educated mind with time available for thought. Chess had been present in England since at least the 11th century, arriving through the Islamic world and the Mediterranean trade routes with its full complement of pieces and its essential rules already well established. At the medieval court, chess was a game for the educated and the thoughtful, rewarding exactly the qualities a king was supposed to possess: planning several moves ahead, patience with the slow development of a position, the ability to hold multiple possible futures in mind simultaneously without committing too early to any single line. No computer chess engine sat at the corner of the board offering evaluations and best moves, no instant replay when you misread the position, and definitely no online opponent who could be closed with a click when the game turned against you. Just two minds across a wooden board in a firelit room, working it out for themselves with time and silence and the low sound of the fire. Tables, the game we would now call backgammon in one of its several medieval forms, was a popular alternative to chess and an older one, faster in its play and more dependent on the luck of the dice than on the calculation of positions. The combination of skill and chance in tables made it a different kind of pleasure from the purely cerebral demands of chess. The dice constrained the options and the player chose among them, so the game was a conversation between fortune and judgment rather than a pure exercise of either. Dice appeared alongside both games, in their own right, without apology or embarrassment. Gambling at dice was a recognized part of court recreation, and household accounts recorded losses and winnings without any particular moral commentary, as entertainment expenses alongside the costs of candles and the wages of grooms. Music was the other indoor pleasure, and it had a quality in the great chamber in the late afternoon and the early evening that the chase and the chessboard could not quite replicate. A lute played softly in a warm room at the end of a long day asked nothing of the listener. It required no attention, no response, no participation. It simply filled the air with something that was neither silence nor speech, and after a day full of both kinds of demand, that filling was its own relief. Minstrels, the professional musicians who were part of the permanent household establishment, played and sometimes sang. The king himself might participate, since musical ability was part of the expected formation of a nobleman's son in this period, and many medieval kings were genuinely accomplished musicians rather than merely polite audiences. The line between performer and listener was not sharp in a world where music was a practiced skill rather than a purchased entertainment, shared among the educated members of a household in the way that any skilled activity was shared among those who had been trained in it. The reading of romances was also a recognized afternoon and evening pleasure, and many royal households employed readers, men trained to deliver long narratives clearly and at a good pace, who would read aloud from one of the great verse romances of the period, the stories of Arthur and the Round Table, of Charlemagne's paladins, of the Trojan War retold in the vernacular with its heroes in armour that would have looked perfectly familiar to a 14th century knight. A story read aloud in a warm room, the fire burning steadily, the wine poured and the day's business laid aside, had a quality that is not so different from what you are experiencing now. The slow immersion in a told world, the drift of attention towards something that is neither sleep nor waking, the particular rest of a mind that is listening and no longer required to act. The medieval afternoon, at its most comfortable, was not so different. Romances were read aloud in the evening hours, the great cycles of Arthur and his knights, the story of Lancelot and the court of Camelot, the tale of Tristan and Isolde, and the sweetness and the bitterness of their fate. A literate chaplain or a squire or chamberlain read to the assembled company while the fire burned lower and the afternoon aged into evening, the voice steady and clear, the story moving through its moral textures. Courage, loyalty, honor, love and its obligations, the tragedy of a world where the ideal and the real were in constant and painful negotiation, while the real world outside the chamber, Windows went about its own quieter business. Even the King's play was, in some sense, still performance. The games and the leisure were appropriate to his rank, and to the image his court was supposed to present to itself and to the world. A king who was musical was a more complete and admirable king than one who was not. A king who hunted well was demonstrating qualities his subjects and his household valued. The afternoon was his own in a way the council chamber was not, but it was never entirely private in the sense that modern solitude is private. The afternoon was simply the part of the day in which the ceremonial weight was lightest, and the warmth of the fire and the music of the lute and the slow movement of the chess pieces were allowed to be simply what they were, without needing to mean anything beyond themselves. There is also a dimension of the afternoon's leisure that is easy to overlook, the dimension of genuine enjoyment. It is tempting, looking at the medieval court from the outside, to see the whole of the king's day as performance and obligation. The mass performed, the council performed, the hall performed, and even the recreation performed. And there is truth in that. But there is also something else, less easily documented and therefore less often described. The simple pleasure of being outside on a good autumn day, of watching a well-trained hawk make its first climb into cold blue air, of the fire and the wine and the board game as the afternoon darkened and the light outside was failing and the room was warm. Kings were people, and people, including people who live their lives inside the elaborate structure of ceremony, find genuine rest and pleasure in the spaces where the ceremony eases. The medieval king's afternoon, for all that it was the afternoon of a king, and therefore still attended and still observed, was the portion of the day in which he was most allowed to simply be. The hunting was vigorous and physical, and demanded his complete attention to the ground and the animals and the wind. The chess was a private contest of a mind against another mind, without any audience to perform for. The music, heard in the close warmth of the chamber, was simply heard, not as a demonstration, but as a pleasure. You might picture the king in the late afternoon, the chess game half played on the board beside the fire, the lute in the hands of a musician somewhere across the room, the light outside the window going, the particular deep gold of a late autumn afternoon that will soon be dark. The day's work is done. The evening has not yet quite begun. The fire crackles softly in its hearth. And for this hour, the ordered round of the royal day pauses at its most human point, the person at the centre of everything allowed, briefly, to simply rest. The king is the fountain of justice. The good news, if you had a genuine wrong to bring to the king, was that the system existed, and it worked often enough that people made the journey from considerable distances to use it. The less straightforward news was that getting your petition to the right level of royal attention required navigating a carefully guarded system of access, and that system was controlled by men who had their own reasons for deciding who reached the king and who did not. By today's standards, you would hire a lawyer, file documents through a court system, and wait for a hearing with a fixed date and a defined procedure. In the medieval world, you came to the palace, found the right intermediary, convinced him your case deserved the king's own consideration, waited in the outer rooms until the chamberlain's office admitted you, and then knelt on the stone floor before the raised dais and made your plea in the best words you had. No appointment system, no legal aid, no numbered queue, only the long wait in the outer rooms and the chamberlain's eventual nod. This was not merely a phrase worn smooth by long use, though it has that quality of repetition that attaches to ideas that have been true for a long time and have been said accordingly many times. In the medieval understanding of royal authority, justice did not flow through institutions that existed independently of the king's person. It flowed from the king as its living source. The courts, the writs, the officers of the law throughout the realm, these were the channels through which royal authority reached into the world, but the authority itself was personal, residing in the king's body, in the king's will, in the king's capacity to say what was right, and to have that saying translated into action by the machinery that existed to serve it. When a subject had been wronged and sought remedy, the most direct path to remedy was the king himself. This meant that kings received petitioners. The petition, a formal plea addressed to the king, requesting his grace or his correction of a wrong or his conferral of a favour, was one of the most fundamental instruments of medieval political life, available in principle to anyone who could bring one to the king's attention and persuasively present it. It could take the form of a written document, presented through the appropriate clerks and answered with the relevant writ. Or it could be a personal approach to the king's court, a plaintiff or supplicant presenting themselves in person at the palace, seeking to make their case and receive the king's response face to face. Both forms were in regular use throughout the medieval period, and both required the navigation of a carefully organized system of access to the king's person, a system that was itself a form of governance, since the management of who could speak to the king was the management of who could be heard at the center of power. The ceremony of approach was precise, and its precision was meaningful. You did not walk up to a medieval king and speak to him as you might walk up to an ordinary person and speak. The correct approach required kneeling as you came before him, your head uncovered, your posture expressing in physical terms the distance between your position and his. The king was raised above the hall floor on the dais where his throne or his great chair stood, and the petitioner remained on the lower level, a spatial arrangement that translated the relationship of authority and deference into physical space so that it was visible to every person in the room. The chamberlain and the ushers controlled who entered the space where the king received petitioners, in what order and at what remove from the king's person. Access was graded in multiple ways, by the nature of the business, by the rank of the person bringing it, by the particular moment in the day and the king's own schedule and appetite for receiving. The most favoured petitioners might be admitted to the inner chamber for a conversation of some privacy. Others were heard in the outer hall, in full view of the assembled household. The most routine business was directed entirely through the clerks, never reaching the king's personal attention at all. And the allocation of a petition to one of these channels was itself a consequential decision, managed by the Chamberlain's office with a constant awareness of precedent, of the petitioner's standing, and of the internal politics of the court. Access to the king was the most valuable commodity at court, and controlling access was an exercise of power. The chamberlain who decided which petitioners were admitted and which were redirected was, in a very real sense, shaping the distribution of royal favour. The king, for his part, had been practising the role of receiving supplicants since long before his reign began. He had watched it performed in the great halls of the households where he was raised and educated, had participated in it as the heir apparent, and had been its central figure since the moment of his coronation. He knew how to hold the posture of dignified attention that the reception of petitioners required. The listening face, the considered question asked in a measured tone, the slight inclination of the head that indicated the decision had been made and should be noted by the clerk at the room's edge, who would translate it into the next step of the appropriate process. The king's charity, beyond the specific ceremony of the almoner and the alms dish at dinner, was a daily obligation distributed across several regular forms. The royal almoner managed the broader pattern of the king's charitable giving. The daily alms distributed at the gate in the king's name, the distributions of food and clothing on the great feast days of the church's year, the particular religious establishments that the king had endowed or was in the habit of supporting with regular grants. These were recorded in the household accounts as a matter of course, and the pattern of a king's giving was, for the historian with access to those accounts, as revealing as any other aspect of the household's record. The amount and direction of royal charity was not a private sentiment. It was a public statement about the king's understanding of his obligations, as clearly as his attendance at Mass or his conduct of the council. On Maundy Thursday, the Thursday before Easter, taking its name from the Latin mandatum, the commandment, recalling the gospel account of Christ washing his disciples' feet at the Last Supper, many medieval kings performed the royal Maundy, washing and feeding the feet of a number of poor men corresponding to the king's own age in years, imitating in their person the humility that the gospel described. The act was public. It was witnessed by the court and by the poor men themselves, and by whatever others gathered to see it. It was also, in the understanding of those who performed it, a genuine statement about the relationship between the king's power and the power that underwrote his own. The king who knelt to wash the feet of the poor was performing the most literal enactment of the theology of Christian kingship. The one who serves the greatest is the one who serves all, including the humblest. And there was the royal touch. The kings of France, from some point in the 11th century, and the kings of England from at least the reign of Henry I, were believed by their subjects to possess in their royal bodies a specific healing virtue, the capacity to cure scrofula, a chronic and disfiguring skin condition affecting the lymph nodes called the king's evil precisely because of this belief, by the simple act of touching those who suffered from it. The ceremony was straightforward in its form. The king touched each sufferer in turn, laying hands on them while a cleric intoned a verse from the Gospel of Mark. They shall lay hands on the sick and they shall recover. And then the king presented each patient with a small coin, probably a penny, as a token of the encounter. What was happening in this ceremony was the most compressed expression of what sacred kingship actually meant in practice. The king's body was not merely a human body. It was a body with a specific and real relationship to the divine, and that relationship had physical consequences that could be experienced by those who came near it. The belief was genuine. On the part of the sufferers who came seeking the touch, sometimes from considerable distances, on the part of the clergy who assisted, and on the part of many kings who understood the ceremony as a real obligation of their sacred office. Scholars note that the scale and frequency of the practice varied considerably across different reigns and is debated in the historical record, and it is only honest to acknowledge that the evidence is uneven. But the belief itself was real, and in a world organized around the premise that spiritual realities had physical consequences, belief was what made the ceremony true. There were no antibiotics for scrofula, no dermatologist to refer the sufferer to, no clinical trial that had measured the efficacy of the royal touch against anything else available. What there was the king and the ceremony, and the genuine hope of the people who made the journey to receive it. The afternoon of petitions and charity drew to its natural close as the light outside the hall's high windows changed from the even brightness of midday to the lower, yellower light of late afternoon, and the household's attention began, without urgency, to shift from the day's business toward the evening's quieter pleasures. There is one more dimension of the king's charitable role that deserves attention, something that runs through the whole fabric of his public duties and connects the petition hearing and the almsgiving and the maundy and the royal touch into a single, coherent idea. The medieval king was not simply an administrator of justice in the legal sense. He was, in the theology and the political thought of the period, a sacred figure, not a priest, not a clergyman, but a person whose consecration at the coronation had given his body a particular and real relationship to the divine order. The anointing with holy oil at the coronation, the chrism applied to the hands, the breast, the shoulders, the head, was understood not as a ceremony but as a transformation. It changed what the king was, not merely what he was called. This theology had practical consequences for how the king spent his days. It meant that his charity was not merely good social policy or a conventional display of noblesse oblige. It was an obligation of the sacred office, a required performance of the care and grace that a figure of consecrated authority owed to those in his protection. The king who did not give, who did not hear petitions, who did not perform the maundy and the touch and the daily alms, was not merely an unkind man. He was failing in the specific duties of a sacred office, and that failure had implications not only for his political legitimacy, but for his relationship with the divine authority that underwrote that legitimacy. This is why the petition ceremony was conducted with such care and such formality, why the kneeling and the uncovered head and the controlled access and the elevated throne were not simply expressions of royal vanity, but components of a theologically understood encounter between the sacred royal body and the subjects who depended on it. To approach the king correctly was to approach the mediator of divine justice in the realm, and the mediator of divine justice deserved to be approached in the correct form. You can feel something of this, perhaps, in the particular atmosphere of the chamber of audience when the petitions are being heard, the particular attentiveness of the room, the way the household that is present holds itself slightly differently than it does in the council chamber or the hall. This is not a purely administrative encounter. It is also a kind of ritual conducted daily in which the king's sacred function is made visible and available to those who need it. The good news, for those who came with a genuine wrong to be righted, was that the system worked often enough to be worth the journey. The less good news was that getting your petition to the right level of the king's attention, past the chamberlain and the ushers and the clerks, was a task that could consume considerable time, money, and persistence before it succeeded. By today's standards, the whole process, the kneeling, the graded access, the gatekeeper who determined whether your plea reached the king's own ears or was redirected to a clerk, would look cumbersome, even arbitrary. By the standards of a world that had no other reliable mechanism for the redress of wrongs that powerful people had committed against weaker ones, it was what was available, and for many it was the last and most powerful option they had. The day closes the way it opened, only slowly in reverse. The hall fills one more time in the early evening for supper, a lighter meal than the midday dinner, shorter in its ceremony, without the full formal apparatus of the great daytime occasion, though still conducted with the forms appropriate to a royal household. The high table and its cloth of estate are in their places. The grading by rank is observed, as it always is. The service officers attend the king's table with the same attentiveness, the same choreographed sequence of presence and gesture that they bring to every meal. But the mood of the hall at supper is different from the mood of the hall at dinner. The governing is done, the council has dispersed, the petitioners have been heard or redirected, and the supper is taken in the particular quality of unhurried ease that belongs to an evening that knows itself to be an evening. After supper, the hall empties gradually, and the remaining evening settles into the chambers. The fire in the king's great chamber is built up from its afternoon maintenance to the fuller warmth appropriate to the evening. A more generous blaze, the room heating deliberately toward the temperature that makes it a pleasure to be inside rather than simply a room you have not yet left. Candles are lit in their brackets, and the room takes on the warm, enclosed quality that it has at night, smaller and closer and more defined than it is in the cold grey light of the morning. Music in the evening hours was quieter than the afternoon's outdoor energy. A lute or a soft voice, the kind of music that is content to be heard without requiring active attention, that fills the background of conversation or of companionable silence without demanding to become the foreground. A board game in the firelight, the pieces moved slowly and thoughtfully, the conversation of the players low. The continuation of the romance from the previous evening, the story resuming its forward movement through the familiar world of the tale, while the real world outside the chamber windows went quietly about its own nighttime business. The evening was the part of the day when the court's formality relaxed most, and there was genuine warmth in it. The warmth of the fire and the more intangible warmth of a household that had spent a long day together in the organized performance of its collective roles and was now, in the last hours before sleep, allowed to simply be in one another's company without the full weight of ceremony. The king was still the king. His place in the room was still the center. But the register of the evening was gentler than any other part of the day. Then comes the coucher. At the grandest courts, and the Burgundian court provides, again, the most fully documented form. The going to bed was the mirror of the morning's rising, an ordered ceremony with its own appointed attendants, its own sequence of actions, its own hierarchy of who might be present at each stage of the undressing. The same principle of honour and attendance that governed the lever governed the coucher equally. To be the officer who received the great lord's robe at the end of the day was an honour commensurate with being the officer who helped him into it at the beginning. The ceremony was the ceremony of the day's bookends, and in a world that understood ceremony as the expression of order rather than merely the performance of it, the closing ceremony was as important as the opening one. The English medieval coucher was generally plainer than the Burgundian ideal, as most English medieval ceremonial was plainer than its continental counterpart. But the underlying structure was the same wherever it was practiced. The king does not undress alone in a corner as a purely private act. The attendants are there. The sequence is followed. The great robe comes off and is received by the officer of the wardrobe, who will see that it is properly stored and ready for use again in the morning. The shoes come off. The ring comes off. Each article of dress is handled with the same care as it received in the morning, and each is put away in its correct place by the people whose specific job it is to know where that place is. The bed has been prepared. The mattress inspected. Household documents of sufficient detail specify that the royal bed should be checked in a ceremonial way, a formal touching of the covers and the mattress to verify that they hold nothing they should not hold, a small domestic ceremony that enacted in miniature the same logic of protection that the assay enacted at the dinner table. The sheets are the finest linen in the palace, changed and laundered at the appointed intervals. The coverlets are arranged in their correct order. The pillows are placed. The whole great curtain structure is ready, as it was ready this morning, and as it will be ready again tomorrow morning, because the readiness of the king's great bed is not the outcome of a particular effort on a particular day. It is the permanent condition maintained by permanent effort. Before the king takes to his bed, the voidee. The void cup, the last refreshment of the evening, was a practice common in many great households, a final offering of spiced wine and wafers, sometimes served in the hall to the departing household as a whole, sometimes taken in the chamber with the immediate attendants only. Spiced wine, hippocras, in many households, wine infused with warming spices such as cinnamon, ginger, and honey, was a natural choice for the evening cup. In the medical logic of the medieval world, a warming drink before sleep was sound practice. It aided the digestion and gently prepared the body for the cooling and the stillness of the night. The cup was offered with ceremony, received, and drunk. The cup-bearer stepped back. The evening's formal service was very nearly complete. The all-night livery, the provisions left in the chamber for the hours of darkness, was specified by the household ordinances with characteristic precision. The Black Book of Edward IV attended to this detail as it attended to everything. Bread and wine or ale set ready on the chest by the wall, accessible in case the king woke in the night and wished for refreshment. Candles arranged so that a light could be struck without difficulty in the darkness. The fire set in the hearth at the right level. Not a full fire, which would need feeding through the night, but a banked fire, a deliberate arrangement of coals and ash, that would hold a steady low heat through the hours without requiring any attention until morning. By today's standards, a thermostat and central heating would replace all of this seamlessly and invisibly. But the banked fire required the same skill as everything else the household did, learned, practiced, and applied with the care appropriate to its importance. Nothing in the royal chamber, not even the arrangements for a possible waking at 2 in the morning, was left to improvisation or to chance. The candles are snuffed now, most of them. One is left burning at the bedside, a single small flame casting its circle of amber light on the curtains of the great bed and the stone floor around it and little else beyond. The fire settles in the hearth, banking itself to its low red watch. The curtains of the bed are drawn. The king is inside them, in the warmth and the quiet of the great curtained enclosure, on the feather mattress under the fur-lined coverlets. The whole deliberate machinery of the day, the rising, the washing, the chapel, the council chamber, the hall at dinner, the afternoon's recreation, the petitioners, the supper, the coucher, the voidee, has brought him to this point, one person, warm, in the dark, quiet at last. But the chamber is not empty. The esquires and grooms of the chamber who hold the night watch remain in or just outside the room, keeping their quiet vigil through the dark hours. This was not a casual arrangement or a convenient domestic habit. The body of the king, the sacred body, the body that had been touched this afternoon by supplicants seeking healing, the body that had sat in the chapel this morning and in the council chamber and at the high table in the hall, the body in which the divine sanction of royal authority resided and from which it expressed itself in the world, was watched over through the night by men who had been given this as the most intimate and most responsible trust of their service. They did not speak. They did not make unnecessary sound. They moved when they had occasion to move at all, with the particular deliberate quietness of people who had practiced for a long time the art of being present without being noticed. The palace gates are locked. The watch is set at the outer walls, changing at its appointed hours through the night. In the kitchen, the fires are cooling, the last coals raked over and covered. In the stable, the horses are quiet in their stalls, the straw settling under them. In the chapel, the single candle burns before the altar as it burns every night, not defeating the darkness, not filling the whole chapel with light, but marking one small point of warmth and steady flame within it, keeping the vigil that belongs to the chapel and that the chapel keeps without sleep. Through the corridors and in the chambers beyond, in the dormitories and on the pallets and benches and straw mattresses where the hundreds of the household have found their rests, the great house is growing still. The clerk of the chancery has put away his last roll and blown out his candle. The almoner has made his final count of the day's giving. The marshal's grooms have finished their rounds of the stable. The officer of the buttery has locked the last of the wine away. Each of the household's many offices has completed its day's work and laid it down, in the correct order, in the correct place, as the ordinances specify, and as long practice has made second nature. The whole vast turning house has found its stillness. There is something in this nightly settling that reflects the day in miniature. The day was a movement from the intimate toward the public, from the curtained chamber, through the chapel and the council and the hall, and outward into the full performance of the royal office, and then back inward again, through supper and the evening chamber and the coucher, toward the curtained enclosure where it began. Each day described the same arc. Each day moved through the same sequence of spaces and offices and ceremonies, from the private to the public and home again. And the household that made this possible, that lit the fire and laid the robe and heard the mass and served the hall and set the watch and banked the embers, did so not once or twice, but every day of the king's life, in every palace he inhabited, on every road between one residence and the next. You could hear this, perhaps, in the stillness that the house achieves at this hour, the particular silence of an institution that has done its work, fully and in the right order, and has put its work to rest. And at the centre of it, in the great bed behind the drawn curtains, the one person for whom all of this exists is asleep. Not a king now, or not only, simply a person, warm and watched over and tended, held in the care of hundreds of people whose entire day existed, from the fire built in the dark before dawn to the candle left burning at the bedside now, to carry him gently through another ordered day and bring him to this, the rest that the day's ceremony was always moving toward. Now the night holds everything. The chamber is warm, the fire at its low red watch, the single candle steady at the bedside, casting its amber quiet across the drawn curtains of the great bed. Outside the window the night is fully itself, cold and very still, the palace walls holding the dark at their edges. The household sleeps in its many layers, each person in their appointed place. The groom of the chamber nearest the king, then the outer chamber servants, then the hall and the further offices and rooms, each at its correct distance from the centre, as the ordinances have always specified, and as long habit has made as natural as breathing. The gates are locked. The watch is set. The chapel's candle burns. The seals are in their chests. Every hour of this day had its office. Every office had its man. Every man had his place. And the whole great structure of the day moved, through the rising and the dressing and the chapel and the council and the hall and the afternoon and the petitions and the supper and the coucher, with a slow, deliberate, ordered calm that is, at this long distance, one of the most peaceful things to contemplate. A world in which even a king's day had its shape and its limit, in which even sovereignty was subject to the simple rhythm of the hours. You are warm enough, attended enough, carried enough through the day. Whatever the day held is laid down now, each piece in its correct place, as it always has been. Let the banked fire be sufficient. Let the one steady candle be enough light. Let the dark be what it has always been, the household's gift to itself at the end of every long and ordered day. The great bed holds. The curtains close. The night carries you down, gently and without hurry, toward wherever the quiet leads. Rest now, as they once did, in a house that knew its order, and kept its people safe while they slept. Sweet dreams.